We get lots of questions about our off-grid solar setup, probably because you can see it in the background of a lot of the videos that we make as we're doing all sorts of things around the land and working on the house renovation. We get lots of simple ones like how many panels do we have, how many batteries, stuff like that. But some people also want to know what it's like to live off-grid. And in particular, we've had lots of questions about how it's working running our heat pump to provide heating and hot water year round. And we've had lots of questions about how we got on over the winter. And so we thought we'd do a bit of an update video, talk you through the whole system we've got now, but also how we started with it, how it's changed over the years, and we'll also show some of the stats and the data as well. And I thought it would be an interesting time to do this and have this conversation because earlier this week, a large part of Portugal, and I think also France and Spain, had nationwide blackouts because of problems with the EU power grid. And we didn't notice at all because we are completely off-grid and we had power throughout the day. So I guess that's one of the big benefits of being off-grid, but of course there are pros and cons to it as well, and we'll discuss some of those throughout the video. Anyway, I thought we'd start with a bit of an overview of what the system is that we have now and answer some of those high-level questions about how many panels, how many batteries, all that kind of stuff. Since we're outside, let's start with the solar panels themselves. How many do we have? We have 12 of them. We have 12 in 2 sets of 6, or 2 strings of 6, I guess is the correct term. We've got one set of 6 400-watt panels, which gives us up to 2.4 kilowatts of power. And then we've got 6 times 485-watt panels, which brings our total to 5.3 kilowatts of potential solar generation at any one time. Inside the shed that you can see behind me is where we used to have all of our equipment. Most of that has now moved to the house, which we'll talk about a bit later on. But in there we have a string inverter, which takes all of the power from these panels, turns it into electricity that all of our appliances can use. That piece of kit is made by a company called FEMA, who are Spanish or Italian, European anyway. It's a 6 kilowatt inverter and it sends all of the power in a big cable underground to the house. Inside the house, in our plant room, which is also doubling as an editing suite and storage area at the moment, is where we've got all the rest of the other solar equipment. We've got 2 racks of Pylon Tech batteries, giving us just over 21 kilowatt hours of battery storage. And we have 2 off-grid inverters inside there. Each one is 5 kVA. They're running in parallel to give us a total of 10 kVA potential power that we can draw at any one time, but they can peak up to 20 kVA if we're running something like a table saw or a motor or something that has a high startup power. But very rarely do we get into those kinds of realms of power usage. So that's the system as it stands right now, but that is not where we started. We started with something much, much smaller, but we'd always designed the system knowing where we would need it to end up in the future. So we chose equipment that we could build up in like a modular or a stepwise fashion so that we didn't have to invest everything up front at the very beginning and we could add to the system over time. And we've done that maybe 3 or 4 times. And if we ever want to or need to, we do have the option of adding a grid connection in the future. That's not something that we're planning to do at the moment, but it's nice to know that it's there as like an ultimate backup if for any reason we get tired of this whole off-grid living thing. I don't see that happening, but it's always good to have a backup plan. So let me walk you through a bit of a timeline of what we installed when and how the system has grown over time and adapted to our changing needs.
So it was way back in January 2021 that we installed the first system, and this consisted of the 6 400-watt solar panels, 1 5 kVA inverter, and 9.6 kilowatt hours of batteries, so about half what we currently have. And we installed all of this in the shed that we built, on the deck that we built, whilst we lived in a tent during the first 3 years of our house renovation project. And I'll keep track of the costs for you as well. The first system that we installed was €6,250. In October of that year, to help us get through some of the bad weather during the winter, we added a small petrol-powered generator which would help us recharge the batteries when there wasn't so much sun. This motor generator now retails for something like €850, but I think we paid much closer to 500 at the time. And this was the system that we lived with for the best part of 2 years. But as the house renovation progressed and we needed more power, we decided to expand the system. We added 6 more solar panels, we added the FEMA in the shed and switched from a DC coupled system to an AC coupled system. We added a second inverter in parallel, and we added another 2 batteries, taking our total to 14.4 kilowatt hours of storage. There were a few extra cables and things involved in all of this as well, and the cost for this upgrade was €7,500. Much more recently, in December 2024, we added 2 more batteries, but these were larger, 3.5 kilowatt hours each, so we added 7 kilowatt hours of batteries, and we also bought a 5 kilowatt diesel generator. Unfortunately, this generator broke down after just 30 hours of runtime, and it's been at the repair shop for the last 6 weeks. Fortunately, we've still got the original generator, which we've only used a couple of times since the Pramac one died in March this year. The cost for the batteries and generator was approximately 3,800 euros, bringing our total investment in off-grid solar power to a grand total of 18,000 euros, including tax. Next year, we're hoping to build a large garage structure. This will be south-facing and have space for all the solar panels on the roof, and this will help prevent the panels getting shaded out in the low winter sun. We're also planning to relocate all the solar equipment into this building when it's finally built, but we're waiting on planning permission for that. We do also have another building to renovate where we may end up adding more panels in the future, and when this happens, we'll connect everything up so we have both AC coupled panels and DC coupled panels. And if you want to know more about what all that means, check out this other solar update video we made a while back. There'll be a link in the description.
So I think sometimes there can be a misconception that being off-grid is only suitable if you've got like a remote cabin in the woods, an RV or a camper van or something like that, where you want a small system for being out in the middle of nowhere. But you can actually run an entire family home on off-grid power, whether that's solar or wind or hydro or a combination. We just have solar here. We have looked at wind as a backup, but based on the research we've done, it's not efficient or cost effective for us to go down that route. So we're sticking with solar for now. And we haven't got a stream or a waterfall nearby to do hydropower, which is a bit of a shame. And whilst there are some compromises with living off-grid and being mindful of the power that you're generating and consuming, we definitely haven't compromised on all the modern conveniences and appliances inside the house. We've got all the usual things like lights in every room, although we've only wired the downstairs so far because the upstairs is still very much a work-in-progress renovation. We've got TVs, we've got phone chargers, we've got computers, laptops, sound systems, all that kind of stuff. In the kitchen, we've got all the things that you might expect, like kettles, toasters, blenders, stick blenders, juicers, food processors. We do a lot of cooking stuff. We've also got a big fridge and freezer, and I have a kegerator to keep all my homemade beer chilled at the perfect temperature. And we've got a big range cooker with an induction cooktop, so electric hobs. There's 5 rings on the top, there's 2 ovens and a grill, and then there's like a big extractor hood over the top. So the kitchen is one of the places that we draw a lot of power on a daily basis. The tick over power of things like fridges and freezers, but then also cooking meals for breakfast, lunch and dinner. But beyond that, all of our heating and hot water is also electric. We've got an air source heat pump and then a 300-litre water tank inside, which does all the domestic hot water for kitchen sinks, bathroom sinks, baths, showers, all that kind of stuff. But then also runs our underfloor heating system, which we've got installed downstairs at the moment, but we're also going to be putting on the first floor as well. So we have electric everything. We don't have any mains gas, we don't cook on gas or any other source of energy. And so now you know a little bit about the system that we've got and the kinds of things that we can power with it. Maybe it'd be interesting to take a look at some of the data and the stats to show some of the numbers of how we've been using the system over time. So let's jump into the computer and geek out a little bit.
Hello and welcome to The Computer. I'm sitting in the plant room. I can hear the solar equipment buzzing behind me. We're looking at the dashboard for our installation. The majority of our equipment is from Victron Energy. We do have the FEMA inverter, the string inverter in the shed, but apart from the batteries, the rest of the kit is from Victron. And at the top here, we're looking at the current input and output and state of charge of all the batteries. We've got loads of sun coming in. The batteries are almost fully charged, so they're just kind of trickling up to 100% at the moment. And I think Kylie is doing some angle grinding somewhere, which is why the AC load is kind of spiking up and down a little bit. She's cleaning up some sleepers for our garden beds. But I wanted to show you a few things down here, which is the system overview from different date ranges. And to begin with, I'll bring up the lifetime production and consumption graph so you can get an idea of what it has done for us so far. So since we installed it in January 2021, up until now in April, or it's actually the 1st of May 2025, we have produced 8,323 kilowatt hours from solar power. We have consumed 8,090 kilowatt hours. And it's a bit confusing because it says from grid and generator. The generator number is very low at 4.5 kilowatt hours. The from grid is 373, but they're both actually generator use. We do not have a grid connection. We're off grid, but there's been some configuration changes over time. And so the system thinks that we have had a grid input and generator input, whereas it's actually all from a generator. So the thing that might be interesting here is that our consumption is less than the solar production, but we've still had generator use. But that's because we're looking at this across multiple years. And on some days, we have generated more power than we have consumed. And on some days, we've needed a generator to allow us to consume power because there's been low solar production. But as a general rule, we can't ever produce more power than we can consume. Let's instead look at the last 12 months to get an idea of how things have been working recently. So over the last year, we've produced 3,300 kilowatt hours, consumed 3,700, and used 220 kilowatt hours from the grid, or in this case, a generator. One thing that's worth noting here is May and June 2024, we spent quite a bit of time off-site, and so that isn't really indicative of the kind of power use that we would normally see in those months. And if we look at the blue overlay over the top of the red and yellow bars on the graph, that's showing the average state of charge, actually the maximum, minimum, and average state of charge of the batteries. And what's kind of interesting is you can definitely see that we get lower state of charge on average during the winter. So September is still pretty good, but October, November, December, January, all quite low. Things then tend to pick up again in February. We get much better light levels in February and March, and so our average state of charge is going up again. If we look at the last 6 months, this kind of zooms in a bit on the winter months where we were using the hot water. We had some underfloor heating use as well. We had a really sunny December, so we had the heating on quite a lot, which is why the consumption is quite high there. But if we look at consumption across the board in each of these months, it's ranging somewhere between 300 and 400 kilowatt hours per month, which is around about 10 to 11 per day on average. If we take a look at a winter's day with low production, you can kind of get an idea of what's going on there. This was the 18th of December last year, 2024. We'd clearly not had much sun the day before because the batteries at midnight were only around 50%, 53%. They continued to drop overnight, and then the sun started coming in again at 9 in the morning, but very, very small amounts. So there was only 3.2 kilowatt hours of solar production for the entire day. And remember that we've got 5.2 kilowatts of panels. So it means we were bringing in just a tiny fraction of that at any given moment and only managed to add 3.2 kilowatt hours of solar production that day. You can also see where we turned the generator on round about 4 o'clock because the state of charge of the batteries is going way up, even though there is no solar production happening underneath. So we took in 4.6 kilowatt hours from the generator on this day. But this is not typical of every winter's day. I actually remember Christmas last year was a really lovely sunny day, almost 15 kilowatt hours of solar generation, but we did use it all as well. That's because I had 2 ovens going, cooking Christmas lunch. At one point, I remember looking at the stats and seeing that we were using 6 kilowatts of power just by having the ovens on, cooking Christmas dinner, along with everything else that was happening that day. So this is almost one of the shortest days of the year, but we had loads of sun and loads of solar production, which is great. But you can still see how it kind of starts off very slow in the morning. We get 3 or 4 hours sometimes of good production in the middle of the day, and then it tapers off again as the evening sets in. And if we look more recently, in the last 24 hours or so, we can see we've had loads of sun today, which is great. 21.8 kilowatt hours of production today. Because we had a rainy day yesterday, we didn't get up to 100% by the end of the day. You can see a couple of spikes. This is me cooking dinner last night, but you can also see these bits of consumption here. We had the tumble dryer on last night because we did some laundry, but the rain and the hail was hammering down yesterday, so we had to put it into the dryer instead of hanging it up outside. Overnight, our tick over is almost nothing, 250 watts, but pretty much constantly throughout the night. The heat pump kicked in this morning at 10:30. So that's our 1.5 kilowatt hours of consumption, more or less, for the hot water. And then this is us using power throughout the day. And it is worth noting that the system itself, the inverters, the battery monitoring system, all of that kind of stuff, does take power to run itself. And as there's more solar coming in, the inverter has to work harder to convert that from DC to AC. So we do tend to see an increase in consumption as there is also an increase in solar production as well. I've also tried to pull out some stats from the heat pump app. Their stats are definitely not as good as the ones from Victron, but this is showing the distribution of how we used the heating and hot water system. So this is a combined total, and it shows that the monthly average use for heating and hot water was 53 kilowatt hours last year in 2024. And we can also look at this month, April, which has just finished. We used 72 kilowatt hours. That was split across the underfloor heating and hot water tank fairly evenly. But we can also see the difference between how much we had to run the heating in April, not very much, compared to how much we had to run it in January when it was much colder. Anyway, I hope some of that has been interesting to look at some of the data from like a real world installation, knowing some of the things that we use all of this solar power for. But let's head back outside and talk about some of this stuff in a bit more detail.
So there are both pros and cons to being off-grid. In terms of the pros, I guess the big one for us is control. We're in control of all of the power that we produce and consume, which means if there is ever an outage, whether it's a small one or an extended one for almost 24 hours like they had the other day, we don't lose power. We have no energy companies to deal with, and we're not at the mercy of any price increases or tariff changes or any red tape or paperwork or anything like that. And it means we're not paying a standing charge whether we use any power or not. That also means we have no monthly bills to pay. And one of the big pros for us is this is a renewable energy source. We're using solar power for the most part, but we do still have some fossil fuel backup when we run a generator. But of course, there are some downsides to being off-grid as well. And the first one is basically the opposite of the major benefit. If one of the main benefits is that we're in control of all of the power that we produce and consume, the downside is that we're responsible for all of the power that we produce and consume. So that means knowing and understanding how the system works and being able to fix it or to get somebody in to fix it if anything breaks. Of course, a big one is the cost. Instead of paying monthly for the service that we use, we've had an upfront cost of many thousands of euros to install this system. But since we're planning to be here for a long time and our power consumption is only going to go up, it means that we'll eventually break even and still won't have any ongoing costs for electricity. One of the other downsides is the backup system that we have at the moment in the form of a generator uses fossil fuels, and that is actually more expensive than having a grid connection. But since we only use a generator about 30 days in an entire year, it's not too bad. And then the last one, which isn't really a big deal, but it is worth mentioning because it is something that we do a lot, is we have to be mindful of the power that we are producing and consuming. So we keep an eye on the apps all the time just to see what the state of charge of the batteries is or to see how much power is coming in at any one time. And occasionally we'll change our behavior or decide not to do something or not to run a certain appliance if we've got bad weather or a cloudy day. So just to give you an example of that, sometimes I will change what I'm planning to cook for an evening if it means using an oven. If we've not had much power during the day, then maybe I won't use an oven. Sometimes we'll also time doing laundry so that we've got plenty of power to run the dryer if it's not already a sunny day. So sometimes we just have to be mindful of those things. But fortunately, the apps that we use to track and monitor all of this stuff are all cloud-based, so we can monitor it from wherever we are, and it's pretty easy to keep on top of. And with the system that we have now, with plenty of batteries and plenty of panels, it gives us a few more days of redundancy if we do have a stint of bad weather. So there we go, some pros and some cons. But for us, the pros very much outweigh the cons, and we're very happy with the system that we have installed. So one question is, why did we go off-grid in the first place and take on that responsibility of generating all of our own power? And this is an excellent question, particularly because the house actually had a grid connection in the past. But to answer the question, we have to understand a little bit about how the grid works here in Portugal. The overhead electricity cables that distribute power to all the cities, towns, villages, and remote hamlets like we live in are capable of carrying different amounts of current. And the amount of power available along the lines in our village is quite small. So if you were trying to run a toaster and a kettle at the same time, it would just trip the main breaker. We actually stayed in a rental property when we first moved here to Portugal for about 6 months, and they must have been on a similar kind of supply. They were living in a similar kind of village context to us. And as soon as I had the oven on, I knew I couldn't do anything else. Maybe have some lights on, but that was about it, because the main supply was so flaky and so small that as soon as you tried to run 2 or more things at once, it just tripped the breaker. And so the reason that we looked into this whole solar and off-grid thing in the first place is because we knew that what was available in our village would not be able to handle all the things that we wanted to install in this house, particularly things like induction cooking and an air source heat pump for heating and hot water. So I guess we could have waited for the infrastructure in the area to improve, but who knows when or even if that would happen. So we decided to go the solar route. So then I guess you could ask the question, well, why go off-grid solar rather than grid-tied solar? And the answer to that is, in order for us to have the house reconnected to the grid, it needed to be entirely rewired. There was just 2 breakers in the house, one for sockets and one for lights. And in order to run all the things that we wanted to run, the whole house would need to be rewired before they would even come out and sign it off and reconnect us. So we're the kind of people who would rather take things on ourselves rather than wait around for somebody else, as you might have noticed if you've seen any of our other videos. And so that's exactly what we decided to do. But we knew from the beginning that we'd be able to start small and build our way up, and we knew that ultimately we could get grid connected again in the future if we ever wanted or needed to do that. So really it was the quickest and most flexible way for us to get going, have power on site, so that we could get cracking with the renovation work. And there were other considerations to the whole off-grid thing as well, not so much from my side but from Kylie's side. Unfortunately she's not here today because she is otherwise engaged. Maybe we'll explain all of that in a future video, but she comes at it much more from a values-based perspective, the sustainable side of solar, the ethical side of things, and so that was definitely a big consideration as well. A question that we get asked quite frequently is, why do we have so many solar panels? And I think this video goes some way to answer that, but I will address it here specifically because the person who asked the question most recently was coming from a UK context. I think they said something like, the average UK consumption is 8 kilowatt hours per day, so why do you need so many panels? And that sounds about right. When we were living in the UK, our average consumption was 10 kilowatt hours. And interestingly, that's about the same here as well, around about 10 to 11 kilowatt hours of power per day. So then why do we need so many panels? And a big part of it is because we are electric everything, including cooking and heating, whereas many homes in the UK have gas for their heating and hot water, and even cooking in some cases. So because we're electric everything, we need more power. But the other aspect to it is how solar production works. So we have 5.3 kilowatts of panels, but in the morning, we are not getting 5.3 kilowatts of power out of them. As the sun moves around and comes up and goes down, the amount of power that we generate fluctuates on a daily basis. And as you've probably seen in this video, the sun comes out, the sun goes behind a cloud, and the power fluctuates throughout the day. But because the system takes that power and feeds it down into batteries, it means that we have continuous power for whatever we need throughout the day. So those fluctuations aren't really a problem, but the fact that we don't constantly get the maximum output throughout the day means we need more panels. And then that is exacerbated in the winter. When the angle of the sun is lower, it means it produces less power. Even in the middle of the day, there is less power during the winter as the angle of the sun changes. And then of course, during the winter, the days are much shorter as well. So whilst in the summer, we might have loads of power coming in from 9 a.m. all the way to 6, 7 p.m. In the winter, we might only start getting decent amounts of power around 10 o'clock, maybe even later. And then sometimes even by 3, 3:30, 4 o'clock, the kind of peak power production really drops off. So that's why we've got lots of panels, and we might even add more in the future, mostly just to deal with the lower production in the winter. But the new carport structure that we're planning to build has space for more than the 12 panels we have. I think there's space for something like 18. And then we have a whole other building that we might put some panels onto as well, and try and optimize them in terms of the different directions that they're facing. So most of these behind me are south facing, although some of them are on a slight curve, so it's not 100% in one direction. The carport that we're building, we've oriented that building south or slightly southeast just to get more sun in the morning. But then the other building, the ruin that we're not going to start renovating for some time, we have the option of putting panels in a south-facing direction, an east-facing direction, and a west-facing direction if we really want to kind of maximize those different times of the day for extra solar production throughout the year. So as with everything, it's kind of complicated and there's lots of factors to consider, but that's one of the things I like about it. We've also had lots of questions relating to the heat pump and the heating and the solar and all that kind of stuff, but I'll summarize the 2 broadest ones. The first one being, why on earth did you install a heat pump when you're running on solar off-grid? Don't they use like 20 kilowatt hours a day or something like that? Well, as we've seen in some of the data that we showed earlier, the heat pump for hot water only uses about 1.5 kilowatt hours per day. And that's because it runs every day, and even though it's a 300-litre tank, it only has to heat the water by a few degrees as it drops throughout the course of a 24-hour period. So hot water is really just using about 1.5, maybe 2.5. If we do a load of dishes and both have a bath or a shower or something like that, maybe we use a little bit more. But typically on a day-to-day basis, the hot water, it's really efficient at dealing with that. And because we don't have particularly cold winters here in Portugal, even during the winter, the heat pump is pretty efficient at doing its thing. But this last winter, whilst we did have the heating on sometimes, we only ran it on sunny days. And that does sound a bit counterintuitive. You can only have the heating on when the sun is shining, but because we've got a stone building and we've got underfloor heating, the time taken for the building to warm up, but also to cool down, is much slower. So it's like a nice kind of gentle curve of warming up and then cooling down. And so whilst we weren't running the heating all the time, the house was fairly comfortable for most of the winter. Now I say fairly comfortable, it could have been warmer, and that would have been nicer. But one of the reasons we chose this system, the Daikin heat pump with the water tank inside, is because it can connect to a backup heat source that we are planning to use for the majority of the winter. So the backup heating system is going to be installed in this room upstairs that you can see behind me. We do need to do some work on the windows as well, which will help keep some of the heat in. We're also redoing the roof as well and putting in some insulation because it currently has none at all. And that's something that we're hoping to do later this year. So the backup system that we're installing up here is essentially a wood burning stove with a back boiler, and that will be connected to the water tank in the room below. So on those days when we haven't got much sun, or if there's an extended period of grey weather, we'll be able to burn wood upstairs and have that heat the tank to provide us hot water in the sinks and the bath and the shower, but also to run the underfloor heating system. And this stove upstairs will have a big flue that goes all the way up through the roof, so that will provide some radiant heat to the room that it's installed in, but also to the entire loft space as well. So we should be nice and warm in the future. We should be able to run the heating whether the sun is shining or not. So I guess the ultimate question is going off-grid worth it? And of course, the only answer is, well, it depends. And most importantly, it depends on your context. If you're asking for yourself rather than for us, I'll talk about us in a second. But if you're in a situation where you have a very remote house, going off-grid might be the only option, because it might cost tens of thousands of euros or pounds or dollars or whatever your currency is to get power to that remote place. Equally, if you're someone who lives on a boat or in a van or something like that, being off-grid for most of the time is probably a good option, unless you don't like electricity. But when a lot of people say, is it worth it, they mean financially. And when you look at it on paper, when you weigh up the cost of all the equipment and potentially the cost of installation and stuff like that, it is very expensive, and it is more expensive than paying an electricity company pay as you go. But I would argue that almost any renewable energy source is not the cheapest option, and the cost is not the reason that most people want to do it. But if the question is it worth it to us? The answer is yes. We've built a system that works for us, that gives us the comfort and the convenience that we desire, that we wouldn't otherwise have been able to get given the low amount of power that's available on the street. I, for one, have also really enjoyed learning about the process, about all the equipment, about the way it all works, and being able to geek out about all the data and stuff too. And like many things on this crazy project, we've been involved with the whole process, so we know how it works, and it means that we're in a better position to fix it and maintain it if problems arise further down the track. And being able to solve your own problems is always a good thing. In addition to all that, there's also all the values-based stuff, the fact that it's renewable energy for the most part, and the fact that we don't have to deal with big corporations who might change their prices for any reason at any time. So I think that's pretty much it. Those were the major questions. We've given you a good overview of the current system and how we kind of staged it up to this level. But if you do have more questions or want to know how something works in a bit more detail, do let us know and we'll do our best to get back to you, or maybe even make a further follow-up video to go into some of those details. But that's it for now. We'll see you next time. See you later. Bye. Sun. Why am I complaining about the sun in a solar video? We're not doing the rooster counter again. But beyond that, But beyond that, our heating and hot water is also electric. Someone's going for a walk. And it means that we're in a better position to fix it and maintain. So what this means is, just waiting for the wind. This was a terrible place to stand to do a piece to camera.